It's really nice to be able to do this. This is my first book talk, so that's exciting too. So today I'm gonna, well, in talking about the book, I'm gonna focus on one part of it to, you know, try to fit it into the time that we have. So I'll just give you a brief overview of what I'm gonna do, and then I'll get right into it. So in my book, what I wanted to do is to rethink inclusion and the way that deliberative Democrats look at inclusion. So one of the things that I really like about deliberative systems are the attempts that they make to really take activism seriously, to be more broadly inclusive, because that's something that deliberative democracy has been struggling with since its inception, trying to figure out a way to move past that barrier where activism was set in tension with deliberative democracy. So there's a lot of really great stuff with deliberative systems and with the enthusiasm for activism. So I started from there. But what I do is take a different look at some of the structural issues that are present. So this focus that deliberative systems have on inclusion is something that, while it has a lot of benefits, I think has some inherent limitations. And so while giving a positive critique of deliberative systems, I don't want to throw them all out the window. I should probably say that before I get started. I do think it's really important to really push on some of the framework issues that cast inclusion as being, in many ways, this great fix. And by looking at activists and their inclusion into deliberative systems as being a really great way and a great move forward for deliberative democracy and for democratic theory more broadly, and for activists and activism. Now, what I would do in the book is to talk about the specific limitations of activism in deliberative systems. And I argue that these limitations exist because of what I refer to as an inclusion framework. And the problem, as I identified in the book, is that when we're looking at deliberative systems, they take place against, in the real world, against the backdrop of systemic injustices. So deep structural racism and sexism and homophobia, transphobia, etc. And because this systemic injustice underpins the background that deliberative systems are in, I argue that this itself makes for some really significant limitations. And so when we're talking about aiming to include activists into deliberative systems, which exist against systems of structural injustice, then the systems that we have are broken, or they're rather deliberately designed by those who have power. Structures of white privilege have so much influence, and they really significantly affect the terms that activists come up against when inclusion is extended to them. Who's extending inclusion? Let's talk about those barriers that are invisible. So that's where I come into the book. And okay, so how I'm going to go through this in the presentation today is, first of all, I'll talk a little bit about deliberative systems and activism, although not too much, because I assume you're all super familiar with that. I'll then say a little bit more about the inclusion framework as I set that out in the book. And then the bulk of my presentation is going to focus on Black Lives Matter Toronto, and specifically their sit-in in the 2016 Pride Parade in Toronto, in Canada, and the exchanges that took place after that. Because in many ways, the focus on this on this visible dialogue that occurred after the sit-in appears to be a really good example of deliberative systems. It seems to be, on its face, a great success. We see the protests sparked a lot of media attention, a lot of discussion. However, I'm going to go through it and argue that it shows the limits of the inclusion framework because of the way in which those exchanges following the sit-in unfolded. Okay, so with deliberative systems, one of the ways that we see protests fitting in is because the systems approach is meant to have a wide variety of activities and institutional arrangements that each perform different tasks, only some of which are explicitly deliberative. And so activism fits particularly well here because there aren't any rules about the ways activists can act, can exert pressure in order to fit into the deliberative system, in order to be included. And a number of deliberative theorists talk explicitly about the fact that activists can be coercive, and that still counts under the framework of including activists in deliberative systems. There's still value to activist participation, even when that participation might be coercive, which we typically think is anti-deliberative. So there's a lot of positive stuff that's going on in deliberative systems with that initial approach to activists, the fact that they aren't restricted in what they can say and do, which of course was the case when Iris Marion Young looked at activist challenges to deliberative democracy, the incompatibility at the core that she talks about. Now, the fact that they can perform all these different tasks and still be part of the system lets us really amplify the benefits of activism, lets us get into a lot of the really rich democratic contributions that activists make and that are often missing or have been missing in deliberative systems. So the idea, of course, is that deliberative systems are much improved by conceptualizing activism in this way, where they belong in deliberative systems, where they can contribute. There's praise for the way that activists confront exclusions, include marginalized people, draw attention to gaps in dominant perspectives, encourage democratic uptake. And all this, again, is really nice to contrast with the way in which deliberative Democrats used to talk about activists. Now, the inclusion framework, the inclusion framework critique that I develop focuses on what we lose when we talk about bringing activists into deliberative systems. So it's not just about making space for activists. And again, there can be many benefits of doing that in deliberative democracy. And it's preferable that deliberative Democrats are talking about the contributions that activists can make than to dismissing activists for not belonging. But I think that we could go a lot further with the way we conceptualize activism and the way we talk about some of the really significant framing questions that deliberative Democrats might be making. There are two main connected problems with bringing activists into deliberative systems that I trace throughout the book. The first is that activist inclusion doesn't fully recognize the value of activism as contestation. Over time, and I'll go through this in some of the examples, the broader power structures that have deep roots in structural injustice really limit what activists, not what they themselves specifically say, but what is heard and what people do with activist critiques, the way that activist messages and criticisms get repackaged and framed. They try to fit them into a system that is fundamentally broken and unjust. So that, I think, undermines a lot of the force of activism. So that's what I'm talking about when I look at contestation. Because deliberative systems take place in the real world and they're characterized by oppression and injustice, unless we really put oppression and injustice specifically and that white privilege and the structures, the power structures of white supremacy at the forefront and challenge them, then inclusion becomes this watered down thing that is going to have fundamental limitations. The second part of that problem is that I argue that with a focus on inclusion, this doesn't see that this way that deliberative systems talk about including activists doesn't meet deliberative democracy's normative goal of treating all people as moral and political equals, because we're pushing activists into a framework that's set by the people who have power, and it's not, the framework itself isn't receptive to activist critique of white supremacy. People freak out when you talk about white supremacy and white privilege, and push people to really talk about the power that they have. So with that in mind, in this scenario of activist inclusion in the framework, we see that when deliberations unfold between the different components in deliberative systems, then these power structures themselves devalue and oppress activists. They reinforce the oppression of activists, and they reinforce this dehumanization and devaluation when we're looking at anti-Black racism, when we're looking at the increased visibility of hate crimes towards Asian American and Pacific Islanders, when we're looking at colonialism and Indigenous peoples. All of this exists and I think gets diluted. So if the frameworks are unjust, which I think it's easy to find a rich body of work talking about the deep structural injustices, the foundational injustices, then no amount of bringing people in to these fundamentally broken, well, from a justice point of view, broken systems, although they may have been designed to maintain power structures, then no amount of bringing people in can fix that problem. Which all sounds really bleak and depressing. I promise that I still have hope for deliberative democracy. Okay, so that's the big framework of the book. I'm going to turn my attention now to a smaller part of the book where I look at this scenario, this example, the case study of Black Lives Matter Toronto and their protest. So for those of you who might not be familiar with the Black Lives Matter Toronto sit-in, this is at Toronto's Pride Parade in 2016, which just gets a ton of people at it. It's probably the biggest one in Canada, I think. The actual event is days long. Black Lives Matter Toronto were invited to be the headliners at the main parade. They were the guest of honor, and there, the Black Lives Matter Toronto staged a sit-in in the middle of them headlining the parade. They sat down at a major intersection. They closed it for half an hour. They stopped the parade for half an hour, and they presented a list of 9 demands that they demanded to be met before they would move. And these demands were given to Pride Toronto, the organization whom Black Lives Matter Toronto had been pushing for years prior to this protest to fix their problems of anti-Blackness within Pride Toronto. And so Pride Toronto, because they wanted to move things along, basically agreed to the list of demands of the Black Lives Matter Toronto handed over to them. The parade continued, but of course this was a major event. It got a lot of media coverage, and there were a number of different exchanges that took place for almost a year afterwards between not only Black Lives Matter Toronto and Pride Toronto, but also dealing with Black Lives Matter was trying to have them talk about anti-Blackness in the city of Toronto, but the problem, and this is why I argue it wasn't actually a good, it's not really a good example of deliberative systems working to help activists, the particular dialogue ended up being captured both by Pride Toronto and by the media and by the city of Toronto, and it really pushed it very far away from what Black Lives Matter Toronto wanted to talk about. So first, I'm going to talk about some of the benefits, just because of the exchange that did take place. I'll talk about some key events too, just because people do look to the dialogue after the sit-in as being a positive example of deliberative systems in action. So the fact that there was a lot of media attention, this is national and some international too, media attention is huge. It's really important to be able to do that. And the media attention was sustained. There have been a ton of things published in the news media about the interactions there. And they've had effects on Pride parades, well, globally, and in a lot of cities in Canada specifically after this. So we know that activism can initiate and sustain significant conversations, which, you know, is a good thing. We see the dialogue that happened also included policy changes. In the end, Pride Toronto did meet all nine of Black Lives Matter Toronto's demands. There's some back and forth on that, which I'll get to in a minute. But it was successful from that point of view. So we can see some of the real world ways that deliberative systems might work to achieve actual change. So Black Lives Matter Toronto achieved some of its goals, but my focus now is going to be on the ways that Black Lives Matter Toronto's activism had a limited impact because of the way it was framed. So the responses to the sit-in, I argue, illustrate the power relations that constrain activist contributions. And I look at this through Black Lives Matter Toronto's specific contributions. Excuse me. So I'm going to talk about the shift in the framing of the post-sit-in dialogue. What started as a critique of anti-Black racism and the demands that Black Lives Matter Toronto set out were very explicit about this and the exclusions that had taken place. It ended up as being a wider and watered down discussion of inclusion that largely avoided the topic of anti-Black racism and in a really meaningful way really skirted what it was that motivated the 9 demands that Black Lives Matter Toronto made and the broader context for why they made those demands, the bigger structural changes Black Lives Matter Toronto wanted to make to dismantle structures of anti-Blackness, to call white supremacist institutions into account. And the fact that the broader dialogue ended up being so watered down happened despite Black Lives Matter Toronto's repeated emphasis of the deeper structural problem. So I just want to emphasize that this wasn't a problem that Black Lives Matter Toronto were responsible for. They frequently talked about anti-Blackness. They frequently talked about the racist structures. They kept reiterating that point, but it kept being respun and reframed and being presented as an issue of inclusion. The dialogue over the sit-in ended up taking place as a twofold controversy over what exactly a twofold controversy coming out of the sit-in. There are 2 main issues that were presented in the media. The first were objections that Black Lives Matter Toronto, quote unquote, hijacked the parade and unfairly prioritized its own claims over others, namely LGBTQ+ people, which of course is a ridiculous way of framing it, given that the members of Black Lives Matter Toronto who organized the sit-in many of them were themselves queer. It was organized by a number of Black queer women. So that's a false dichotomy to make. It completely ignores the intersection of the people who organized Black Lives Matter Toronto, but it was still framed that way in the media as a Black issue versus a queer issue. The other issue that got highlighted and that got even more attention in the media dealt with Black Lives Matter Toronto's 8th demand that police be removed from Pride Toronto in their official capacity as police officers. And this demand was made because of the documented anti-Black racism of Toronto police, police neglect of and violence towards LGBTQ members of the community too. The spin that was put onto these charges, onto this demand that police no longer be there because they posed a violent presence for Black and LGBTQ peoples, was presented as Black Lives Matter Toronto aiming to disenfranchise Black and gay officers. And so it became presented as a problem of exclusion that Black Lives Matter Toronto was actually engaging in. They were the ones being exclusionary and not being fair. So both these two major issues, Black Lives Matter Toronto versus the queer community, and the demand of the demand that police be removed, are both have inclusion, or the lack of inclusion, at their core. As a concern that Black Lives Matter, it was presented as a concern that Black Lives Matter Toronto was excluding LGBTQ concerns by overshadowing them. And it was presented that that trying to bar police officers was excluding gay police officers and not being a welcoming community. Now, I'll talk a little bit about the first part of this, the split between Black Lives Matter and LGBTQ as it was framed in the media. So acknowledging that this focus on two separate identities, Black and queer, is part of the problem. This is something that was missing in the way that it was framed. The media kept coming back to one group versus another. And that poses a deep problem when we're looking at the kind of radical contestation and meaningful, deep structural contestation that activists were trying to communicate, that Black Lives Matter Toronto were trying to communicate. As people who were both queer and Black, that intersection really informed the work that they did, and they kept bringing attention back to that. But despite that, there was this division that was presented in the media. And through this division too, it was also, the issue was also presented as something that only concerned the Black community, and specifically Black Lives Matter Toronto was where the main focus was, and the queer community in Toronto. So it pushed the issue into this narrow and narrower frame, that it's basically a bickering between two different marginalized communities, which is a false presentation, and also serves to further marginalize the criticisms of the deep-rooted anti-Black racism that exists, that Black Lives Matter Toronto argued, it, of course, isn't restricted to Pride Toronto, but is present in the city as a whole, and of course in the country. So this discussion, as it narrowed the focus of Black Lives Matter Toronto's critique of structural racism, the dominant framing became about inequality and marginalization within Pride Toronto. This failed to capture what is at stake. It ignores systemic racism, which again was the whole reason why Black Lives Matter Toronto staged their sit-in, had been pressuring Pride Toronto for years. And it limited the response to Pride Toronto. It detracted from a pervasive problem, while it focused criticisms on an overlapping oppressed community. So instead of opening up the dialogue, in many ways, it focused it and narrowed it and kind of hid it away. The second stream that got even more attention in the media dealt with the police issue. So here we see that one of the problems was that the focus on Pride Toronto weakened and looking at Pride Toronto as being the ones who are exclusionary, and then having the media call for more inclusion. This weakened the force of Black Lives Matter Toronto's attack on anti-Black racism. We see that refusing the police as part of Pride, this was made to appear to contradict calls for intersectionality, which is somewhat ironic since the media framing hid the actual issue of intersectionality in the framing of queer versus Black issues, which was a false dichotomy. But the media repeatedly cast doubt on both the fairness and the inclusive capacity of Black Lives Matter Toronto, and gave outsiders a reason to dismiss much of the critique by using that language of inclusion, by saying that if you are a gay police officer, then you are not welcome. So that became the focus instead of anti-Black racism and the deep violence that the Black and LGBTQ communities experienced at the hands of the Toronto Police Service. There's a letter from a gay police officer that got a lot of coverage and discussion. The title of that was "Exclusion Does Not Promote Inclusion." And that got repeated again and again and again. So it was Black Lives Matter Toronto and Pride Toronto who were framed as being exclusionary and unfair, rather than talking about the deep structural injustices of anti-Black racism. Okay. So to start to wrap this up, and bringing it back to a broader impact for deliberative systems and the deliberative systems literature, we see there are three main institutions that are key actors in this discussion. There's, of course, Pride Toronto, the City of Toronto, and the Toronto Police Service. These all got a lot of attention in the media. However, they're all institutions that fail to truly engage with Black Lives Matter Toronto. The dialogue continued to unfold. There are a lot of exchanges and a lot of media coverage, which again is why this case gets discussed as being a positive instance of deliberative systems in action. But we saw in Pride Toronto's town hall meeting, Pride Toronto presented this town hall meeting as a way to talk about the issues, which we would otherwise think is a good thing from a deliberative systems and activism standpoint. But Pride Toronto framed it as a dialogue to, quote unquote, shed light on a fractured organization and risks in Toronto's LGBTQ+ community. The closest they came to actually dealing with anti-Black racism was in an apology, a formal apology they issued in September of 2016, in which they apologized for a history of anti-Blackness and repeated marginalization in our community. However, this apology was sandwiched between that town hall meeting, the title of which was a wishy-washy inclusion title. And during that meeting, they didn't talk about anti-Blackness in any real sense. They were heckled a number of times by BIPOC people. They mispronounced Latinx people's names. They didn't talk about structural racism in any meaningful way, and were called out for doing that. And then after the formal apology, as a way to try to move forward, Pride Toronto's proposed solution actually bypassed Black Lives Matter Toronto themselves. Pride Toronto proposed a dispute resolution process that would have a neutral outsider come in and didn't require Black Lives Matter Toronto to be there. And so they didn't see people talking about anti-Black racism, and it didn't see Black Lives Matter Toronto involved. They were shut out of that entire process, or they would have been. The dispute resolution process was scrapped because it got so much pushback. But the point is that in bypassing Black Lives Matter Toronto and pushing them out and marginalizing them further, it shows that formal apology where they, said we're really sorry for anti-Blackness, still didn't actually take Black Lives Matter Toronto seriously and didn't want to actually have them be part of the proposed solution. They were pushed out. Another problem from a standpoint of deliberative systems is that in addition to this way in which Black Lives Matter Toronto were shut out from dialogue, the activists themselves where they tried to put them to the side and deal with a resolution in a different way. In addition to that, there was relative silence from other institutions, which shows the limits of Black Lives Matter Toronto's effect on a broader system-wide discourse. We see John Tory, the mayor of Toronto, releasing a statement in response to the question of whether or not police should be at Pride, saying that he is very disappointed that an event that is meant to be, and in fact is all about inclusion, has now somehow become about exclusion, when he announced that police would not be part of Pride Toronto in an official capacity as police officers. So all this dialogue was compartmentalized and failed to permeate the system in the meaningful way that Black Lives Matter Toronto wanted. Nobody, apart from Black Lives Matter Toronto, was really talking in any kind of sustained way about anti-Black racism and the way in which institutions perpetuated this. What they were talking about, what everybody else was talking about, was inclusion, but that was their version of inclusion. It wasn't a world in which Black people are treated as equals and valued and, you know, are free from systematic oppression and police brutality. It was let's all get along, rainbow painting of inclusion that covers over the ongoing structural problems and tries to detract attention away from them. So yeah, I mean, that's basically the gist of it. I don't want to go on for too long, so I'll try to wrap up now. We see that forcing a dialogue and the fact that Black Lives Matter Toronto did that is a really important contribution. But first of all, racism pervaded the reactions and influenced the media coverage. All the empathy was given to, you know, the gay police officer who couldn't go to Pride, to the unfairness of Black Lives Matter Toronto and their unreasonableness, which is another form of racist language, this imposition of respectability politics, and talking about all the ways that Black Lives Matter Toronto were doing things wrong and being unfair and unreasonable, and dismissing the weight of what they were saying. We see the dialogue itself was full of miscommunication and backtracking and a lot of general confusion. And the framing of the debate was really the biggest barrier. That media focus on police exclusion really set the tone. The discussion ended up becoming about a safe and inclusive Pride Toronto and not about anti-Black racism and the continuance of that. And I think I'll just stop there because I could go on for a long time, but I don't want to do that.